This episode is a little quieter than the others. And I want you to warn about that up front because quiet can feel like nothing is happening, but something is always happening in quiet. That's kind of the point of today. We are talking about texture, about traces, and about the marks that appear in a painting that you didn't entirely plan. And why those marks are often the most honest thing in the whole image. But first, let me tell you about Saint-Remy. In May 1889, Van Gogh checked himself voluntarily into the Saint-Paul-de-Mausolée asylum in Saint-Méry. He was frightened of himself. He wanted to be somewhere safe, somewhere with structure. The doctors gave him a room and a second room where he could paint. And they led him into the garden, with a guard watching him because he was not allowed out alone. Can you imagine that? Painting the garden of an asylum with someone standing behind you? And yet, those paintings, the irises, the wheat field visible from his window, the olive trees, are some of the most extraordinary things he have ever made. The Starry Night was painted here, in this room, under these conditions. The circumstances were awful. The painting was extraordinary. These two things are not separate. The texture of those paintings, that almost frenetic energy in the marks, the sky that seems to actually be moving, comes directly from a man doing the only thing that made him feel real, in a place that had taken almost everything else away. For most of art history, texture was an afterthought. The real work was the subject, the composition, the figure, the story. Texture was just what paint happened to do on its way to depicting something else. That started to shift in the 19th century, and Van Gogh was a big part of why. If you ever get the chance to see his paintings in real life, please do if you can. You'll notice something that no reproduction prepares you for. The paint is thick, sometimes extremely thick, built up in ridges and peaks that cast actually shadows on the canvas. You can see where he pressed hard, where he dragged, where he went back into something already half dry and pushed it somewhere new. The surface of an Van Gogh painting is almost sculptural. You don't just want to look at it, you want to touch it. This was increasingly intentional. He understood through practice, through those long conversations with other painters in Paris, through his own letters where he worked things out in real time on paper to Theo, that the surface carries emotion. That how you apply paint is part of what you are saying. A smooth sky reads completely differently from a sky that looks like it was painted in a high wind, which in his case, it sometimes literally was. His brushstroke is one of the most recognizable things in the history of art, those short, energetic, directional marks following the form of what he's painting, sometimes going completely against it, swirling it in the sky, straight and parallel in the fields, radiating from the center of a sunflower, each one placed with a conviction you can still feel 130 years later. He didn't always paint this way. His early Dutch work is careful, tentative, slow. You can see him being polite about it. Then Paris happened. 2 years living with Theo, who was, by all accounts, a saint for tolerating it. Vincent was not an easy flatmate, messy, obsessive, unable to stop talking about painting at 10 at night. He argued constantly, made friends, and then exhausted them. But Paris cracked him open. He saw colors used in ways he'd never encountered in the Netherlands. He found the Japanese prints. He met painters breaking rules he hadn't known exist. And somewhere in those 2 years, the polite marks became something else entirely. Became his. Became the thing we now recognize immediately anywhere in the world, even on a postcard, in a souvenir shop. That didn't happen because he decided to have a signature style. It happened because he practiced so much that his hand eventually knew things his head hadn't caught up with yet. At the North Sea, texture is the whole landscape. You cannot avoid it. Sand that is never one thing, dry and loose at the top of the dune, compacted and dark near the water, completely different color in each state. The sea surface itself changing texture every few minutes with the wind, smooth and metallic on a calm morning, choppy and fractured when the weather arrives, white and almost violent in a proper storm. Van Gogh at the North Sea would have been obsessed with all of it. He would have tried to paint wet sand differently from dry sand. He would have found ways to make the paint itself carry the roughness of a barnacle groin. He would have written to Theo about it, 3 pages probably, about the specific texture of North Sea foam and whether a palette knife or a brush gets it closer to right. Today I want you to paint with something other than just a brush. I mean this seriously. Go find something. The back of your brush, brilliant for scratching lines into wet paint. A piece of cardboard torn to a rough edge. An old sponge. Your fingers if you don't mind the mess, and you shouldn't mind the mess. We've been over this. A palette knife if you have one. A fork. A comb dragged through wet paint makes a texture that looks remarkably like the pattern the tide leaves in sand. Van Gogh used palette knives regularly. He scraped, he pressed, he built surface up and cut back into them. He was physically involved with the painting in a way you can still feel looking at the finished work. That physically is not incidental. It is the point. The title of this episode is about more than texture on a beach. It's about what stays when you strip everything back. When you remove the careful planning and the correcting and the trying to make it look right, what remains? Usually the marks. The evidence of a hand moving across a surface, the scratch of a tool, the drags of a loaded brush, the fingerprint, almost literally, of someone who was present and making something. Those marks are not mistakes. They are the painting. They are the proof that you were there, and that, it turns out, is exactly enough. Van Gogh in his garden in Saint-Rémy. A guard watching, the world very small, he made marks that people are still looking at today, not because the circumstances were right, because he was present, because he kept going, because the marks were real. Make yours real too. Don't plan too much. Pick up something unexpected. Make a mark that surprises you. The mark you didn't plan is often the one that makes the whole painting come alive. Come on, let's paint.